So effects of World War I. So we looked at the treaty debate and how there was a lot of opposition to the Treaty of Versailles within the United States Senate. So in November 19th, 1919, the Senate votes to actually reject the Treaty of Versailles. So it ends up being 7 votes short of the required 2/3 needed for approval per the Constitution. And so you can see how the U.S. does sign a separate peace treaty with Germany, but we do not join the League of Nations and become very isolationist leading into the 1920s and 30s. And so the political cartoon, you can kind of see how the keystone of the League of Nations would be the United States as, you know, kind of the ones who proposed it, as well as one of the most economically powerful and militarily powerful countries in the world at this time in 1919. And without the U.S. support, the League of Nations is not going to be very successful. So other things that happen throughout. So we're going to see women go to work. Participation is going to increase. Support for suffrage. So you can see in pictures, women are working up in the upper left on sewing bandages and other things to send overseas to soldiers. Women work as nurses and ambulance drivers. They're working in munitions factories. That's mainly a job that the lower class are going to take. And so this is going to really increase support for women's suffrage, which you'll need to watch the video on that after this video. The other thing that happens during the war but has big effects after the war is the 1918 flu. It's incorrectly sometimes called the Spanish flu just because that's where the name first comes from and that's what the media calls it, but it's not actually from Spain and it's not caused by the Spanish at all. But we have 675,000 Americans die from the 1918 flu. About 20 to 40 million die worldwide. And so you can see in the graph in the center there how the influenza flu compared to the deaths from World War I, which is 53,000, it was massive. And so that's really going to change society. Think about how obviously COVID deaths are not shown on this chart, on these graphs, because these graphs are from before the time of COVID. But we've had almost 1 million Americans die, and that's going to leave jobs open, it's going to affect families, and it happens in the middle of the war and with all of the soldiers really confined together for training and in camps and barracks and things like that. That's really going to affect our armed forces to an extent as well. We're also going to see the Great Migration happen during the war that has big effects after the war. On the map, we're really focused on the movement within the red box from the South to the North and Midwest. Pushes out of the South are going to include Jim Crow laws, segregation, and racial violence, lynching that's happening. We don't see a ton of migration west to the West Coast until really World War II, as we're not seeing the same numbers of factories for World War I open on the West Coast that we see in World War II. So the pull is going to be the jobs for the wartime as factories open to build ships and munitions, ammunition, things like that, as well as meat packing and grain distribution and all of those kinds of things. And then in the ports, actually loading the ships to go over to Europe is going to be a big wartime job for African Americans. So between 1910 and 1920, the black population in Chicago grows by 148%. Philadelphia grows by 500%. And those are just 2 examples of the mass migration. And a lot of these families had to leave in the middle of the night because they were tied through debt and sharecropping into areas of the rural South, and they're moving up to the urban North and Midwest. And that's going to really change the population, and it's also going to, unfortunately, cause, after the war, major race riots and lynchings in what we call the Red Summer, which is April to November of 1919. So with the Great Migration and all of the movement north, and that's really going to change society, you can see that a big effect, a big cause of the Red Summer is job competition. As white soldiers come back and find that their former jobs had been taken by African Americans, that's going to cause a lot of racial tension and lead into racial violence. We're also going to see that there's this idea that we talked about the Harlem, watched the video on the Harlem Hellfighters in class, and we're going to see that while African Americans are not recognized for their service during the war, there's also this idea that African Americans serving during World War I makes them start to think better of themselves. And so the white population is going to see that as a threat to how society had been structured, especially across the South. And so you can see how in Georgia there are at least 7 cases of major race riots taking place. 38 total happen across the country. The worst of all is going to be in Chicago, where rioting happens for 13 total days after a black boy accidentally swims to the wrong part of the beach and is murdered, and police does nothing. Effects of this red summer, because the federal government doesn't step in appropriately. Remember, this is during the time of President Wilson, who was not in favor of racial integration. He actually resegregated the federal government. And so it's going to lead to the rise of the KKK again. The KKK had kind of settled back underground during the late 1800s and really early 1900s. And with the Red Summer, they're going to kind of pop back up and become much more visible and vocal in U.S. society. We're also going to see at the same time African Americans fight back, sometimes with violent self-defense. So in several cities, including Washington, D.C., during the riots, African Americans armed themselves to try and protect themselves, especially African American veterans who are attacked while in uniform on city streets are going to try and arm themselves. But we're going to see a lot more support for civil rights come out of this, and we're going to see more support, more membership of the NAACP is going to drastically increase after the Red Summer. So there's kind of a unfortunate good spark out of this with the rise of the civil rights movement, and that's going to kind of simmer and continue through the 1920s and 30s, kind of fade away with the 1930s Great Depression, and then after World War II, we're going to see the civil rights movement really increase again. So other effects of World War I, it's going to be the collapse of farm prices. You're looking at the red box on the chart of wheat prices, and how during the war, it's at an all-time high of $2.45 per bushel because we have overseas demand. The United States during World War I is going to be basically supplying the world with wheat and other food products. And then once overseas demand is gone, because the countries overseas can start to feed themselves again, and wartime demand for feeding the army is gone, that's really going to drastically cut prices, which really starts most historians think that the Great Depression for the farms really starts in 1920-21 as opposed to 1929 for the rest of the country. So that's going to be a major downside. So with all of this, all of these big changes with World War I, we're going to see this desire to return to normalcy, which is going to be the campaign slogan of Warren G. Harding, who runs for the presidency and wins in 1920. And really this idea of isolation and focusing on ourselves and business without regulation as we get into the 1920s and the Roaring 20s. And that will be our next unit.